Hello world, it's Craig. I sort of inadvertently started a new project that should interest some of the S-100 advocates and most of the 8080 believers. It seems that I'm making a reproduction version of this solid state memory CB1A, which is an 8080 based single board computer for the S-100 bus. Up until the 1980s and mid-1980s, I was smitten with S-100 and I spent hours studying catalog descriptions of hardware, comparing features and so forth. And last week I came across a file folder that had some old documentation on cards that I wanted. And one of them was this solid state memory card. And, this is from 1983. This is from 1980. These catalogs are 1983. This Byte magazine is 1980. They listed this 8080 CPU, and I really wanted this at the time, but I didn't purchase it because even in 1980 and certainly by 1983, which is what these catalogs were, the 8080 was getting really long in the tooth. And by the time I was ready to spend the money, I got an 8085 system instead. And then I pretty much forgot about this CB1A until I saw it in that file folder. And then after seeing it in that folder, it kind of piqued my interest again. So I started looking around for one. I put up a search on eBay and the like, and I casually asked around, and I found someone that had a couple of unbuilt kits. They had just this Ziploc bag which has the board and the manual, and also they had this complete kit with all of the parts. Now, this is a bit unfortunate since I really wanted an assembled board. And it's not that I don't like assembling boards. I very much like assembling hardware, but I didn't want to face the dilemma about whether or not to build a historic kit. I just wanted a board that was populated that I could, just go back and play with and kind of relive the time that I missed back when I didn't buy one. So as I expect you already know, many boards at that time were available in various stages of completion, ranging from these, simple boards and manuals that were in this, Ziploc bag. You'd find these hanging in your local electronics store. You could get, component kits that had, the manual and all the components. All you had to do was assemble it, and then you could get them, completely assembled and tested. If you look in the catalogs, for example, here you can see, and this is the priority one from 1983, I think. Here's cards you can get assembled and tested. This is $220 for assembled and tested. The manual alone is $10 in this Jade catalog. Here's the kit. So that would be this kit right here was $239. Assembled and tested, $299. The monitor prom was $89 for this. So you could get them in various levels of completion depending on what you wanted to do. Now, you look at that $299, that was not chump change. You have to multiply all these prices by a factor of 3. So, that was $1,000 almost in today's dollars. These catalogs in 1983, the CB1A was so obsolete, they didn't even list this. They had the CB2, which was the Z80 version, and this just completely took over for the 8080 and the 8085 for that matter. So they did have the CB2, but neither of these catalogs had the CB1. Just like phone books, you'd get a new catalog, you would throw away the old one, thinking it was, you'd never want it again. So I only tended to keep the last version of any particular catalog. Now, if you want the thrill of getting a kit like this, you can go to Anchor Electronics. You can pick up these California computer systems. There's the 2718. It's a serial parallel I/O interface. There's the 2065. You can get these kits from Alicia down at Anchor Electronics for, $25. I talked to her the other day and she said that she has at least 2 dozen of the 2718s left and probably a comparable number of the 2065s. And I've purchased these, and in fact I have a couple of here that I think I purchased a couple of sets of each of them and then I built one of them. And, so I have no qualms about building kits that are, 40, 45 years old. You're eroding a little bit of preserved history, but if they're if they're readily available, I don't have a problem building an old kit. But when it came to these CB1As, when I was searching for a fair amount of time, I not only didn't come across very many boards, and no boards that were reasonably priced, but I didn't come across any kits at all, except for these two that I happened to find. So I feel a little bit different about assembling these CB1 kits than these, much more readily available California computer systems. And of course, someday these are going to be as rare as this one. This CB1A manual, this kit, it had 3 labels for the pricing. The first one, there were 2 that were on the manual itself. One was $29.95. The second was applied over that was $31.95. And then this final one was $45. And of course, I wound up paying more than that. These were the prices back then. But by those measures, these boards that you can still get from Alicia for $25, that's a steal. If we look at the specifications for this CB1A, one thing that appealed to me was that it's nearly a complete single board computer. And I've always had a soft spot for single board computers, especially those that are fully expandable like a bus, STD or S-100 or something like that. Of course, you can build as large a S-100 system as you want using this as your CPU board. But since this board has a processor as well as onboard RAM and ROM, you can simply apply power and it'll run by itself. Building larger systems with S-100 was never a problem. Building minimal systems was more of a challenge because there was a limited number of single board computers available for the S-100. So not a lot of processor boards that could just operate alone. And I found this interesting. If you look in the manual, they intentionally designed this board to be partially populated. If you didn't need all the features of a single board computer, with each subsystem, they list which chips needed to be added to make that functional. So for example, this has a vector jump on reset, and if you didn't need that, you didn't have to populate U11, U21, and U22. And you could leave those chips out and everything else would still work. So they did a very interesting job of creating these little standalone subsystems. If you were going to use the system RAM or ROM, you didn't need it on this board, you could just leave those off. If you were just going to use this as a processor board, only about a quarter of the board needed to be populated. And I thought that was kind of a unique way to pitch the board. Even though these chips were only $1 a piece, you could drop these chips off and make a cheaper board. And as a credit to their designer, even as they added this logic glue and these functional blocks to support the sub features, they did a really good job since there does not seem to be any leftover gates on this board. Now, Solid State Music was probably best known for their video cards. Here's their, at the time in the very early 80s when I was looking at this, was the VB1C, the memory mapped video board. Here's the VB3A, so this is a later card that came out. They also made I/O boards, and they made CPU boards, at least for the 8080 and the Z80. I'm not sure they made any CPU boards for things later than that. They made RAM and ROM boards, and of course they made their SB1 synthesizer board. They also made an EEPROM programming board I saw in her earlier. So you could make a nice little system just based on solid state music boards. I'm not sure how long they lasted in S100. By 1985, I was about out of S100, so I stopped looking. And I don't know that they lasted much beyond 1985 or so. And I don't know how compatible their cards were with the later versions of S100. So if we look at the specifications, there were 2 versions of this board. The CB1 was the first version, and it was replaced maybe less than a year later with the CB1A. The CB1 had 256 bytes of RAM using a pair of 2112s, which are 256 by 4s, while the CB1A had a kilobyte, and they basically just swapped out those 2112s for a pair of 2114s, and so the 2114 is 1K by 4. They're both 8080 base with sockets for a pair of 2708 EEPROM, so they have 2K of ROM and 1K of RAM. Either the RAM or the ROM can be completely disabled or individually assigned to configurable address blocks. Furthermore, the boards have that jump on reset feature I mentioned earlier, and so that the board is able to push a jump command. So when you do a reset, it'll push a C3 and then a 00, and then you can set what high byte of the memory you want that to jump to when you do a reset. And this lets you have the RAM down at 0, say if you want to boot from ROM somewhere up higher and you want to boot into load CPM or something. Up here at the top, this is W1, and right here is W2. And you can look at these on the schematic. W1 is an 8-bit input port designed to be used with an ASCII parallel keyboard. So this can be interrupt controlled, or there's a status bit that you can poll to see if the keyboard has strobed in a character. The port address is set with these dip switches, a keyboard connector for W1 for input, and then their video card that I showed you was the target output device. So unfortunately, while there are the 8 data bits and the status bit, there are no output bits at all on this card. So that was W1. W2, if you look at it, it's an empty socket. It brings out the data bus, and the manual says that was available for a front panel interface. But it's pretty limited. They only brought out the data bus, but if you look, the rest of these pins, or the other 8, are unused. So we could repurpose those if we wanted to in this reproduction. I'm not sure exactly how they intended for that W1 or that W2 to be used. So that's pretty much it. S-100, 8080A, kilobyte of RAM, 2K of ROM, and a parallel keyboard input. It's a very nice single board computer. So what to do with these kits? You know, to be clear, as I said, I have nothing against populating 45-year-old boards or kits like these, and I have no ill will for those that take the opportunity to populate such things. If somebody wants bad enough, they can populate these probably. I'm not going to populate this one probably for sure, and if I do populate any of these, it would be this Ziploc kit. In fact, you know, I honestly think that kits like this will be appreciated less by future generations. So, you know, people of my generation that came of age kind of with these kind of kits probably would appreciate populating it more than, you know, our kids or the generation after that or the generation after that. Now, when I make this reproduction, I'm not making any attempt of making a counterfeit that looks exactly like this, that would pass for one of these. You know, these aren't, that's not my goal. My goal is to make a functional equivalent. So just the vintage design can be enjoyed by more people. You know, just like all my projects, I share the build files so people can go out, they can submit these, and I just want to allow more people to enjoy, you know, what they, maybe something that they wanted to have back in the day. On this particular board, just looking at the schematic real quickly, none of the components are all that difficult to find, so I'll use the original components. But I do want to tweak the design, and I'll get to that in a bit. You know, I always improve the labeling. For example, while these original Solid State Music boards, they do have solder mask completed through holes, they don't have silkscreen. So I will add silkscreen labels since that comes for free nowadays. And I will duplicate the layout of the components. And with the bare board, you know, that I have, I can follow and I can see their trace paths. And I'll probably follow their general signal routing because, you know, finally, KiCad, you can put an image in the background when you're laying out boards, so you can do reverse engineering. I can't believe how long that took. You can see these are, you know, naturally curved traces. They were just doing vinyl rub down on this, probably, you know, at 2x and then reduce it to make the films. The curves are very natural. The radiuses are easily accomplished with the narrow traces. These are, you know, no bigger than 12 or so mil. They did take some shortcuts on this with the solder mask, where they ran traces between pads. They masked out the whole row, and so not only is the mask cleared around the pad, it's cleared around the adjacent trace. So where you need it the most, the mask is missing. So, you know, any of these kits are going to be a bit more difficult to assemble than a modern board. I don't think, I don't know, I may, you know, KiCad is still really annoying to do the curved traces on this, so rather than, you know, just angled at 45 degrees. So I may follow some of the curved traces to give it a bit of a looky vintage feel. But so as I mentioned, I'm not making a counterfeit. You know, this is not going to look exactly like this. It'll have silkscreen on both sides. And as I said, I think I want to do a little tweaking to this. You know, I said it was nearly a single board computer, and technically, since it can run by itself, it is a single board computer, but it doesn't have any means to communicate with a terminal. And I see that as a big limitation to this. And I suspect that was by design, since Solid State Music made their video output card, and that was the preferred output device, while this keyboard input was the preferred input device. You know, Solid State Music also made their IO4 serial and parallel port for a paper tape reader, terminal if you had one or whatnot. But the card itself had no I/O, just that keyboard parallel input. And no doubt they took into consideration that if this board did not have a serial port, it would then require customers to either buy their video output card or their I/O card, where if this did have a serial port on it, then you could hook this up to a terminal and, be lost sales in those other two cards. So I'm guessing that that was kind of intentional not to put a serial port on this, but it's a shame nonetheless. In the manual, they talk about 3 minimum systems: the base system, just the board alone, which is operating with no user I/O at all; mid-level configuration that uses their I/O for board to communicate with the serial terminal; or a deluxe system that uses this board's keyboard input and the Solid State Music video output card. Marketing aside, it's a bit of a shame that a COM port wasn't included in the original, and on my adaptation of the reproduction board, I really want to add a single bit output to the board so I can have a bidirectional, bit-banged serial port. Of course, the 8085 would have that built in with the SID and SOD lines, but the 8080 didn't have that capability. But when I do my reproduction, while it's not going to be a copy, I don't want to stray from the original design. I want my version to be able to function exactly like the original, and I don't want to add any more chips or sockets. I want it to look, just kind of nominally. I want to preserve the intent and the look and the feel of the original. And if I look at how to add a serial port in terms of existing hardware, there isn't a lot to work with. So there is that keyboard input port, W1, this data bus port W2, and W2 just has the 8 data bits. So there's another 8 pins, as I mentioned, that could be repurposed if needed if I use W2 for my interface. And the brute force solution would be to just add an address decoder and a latch to create an output port, or maybe a full UART. There were UARTs available then. But that's not my style when doing a reproduction, since it'd be losing the original vibe of this board. And I could make a little daughter board that plugs into either the W1 or the W2, and so I have a little daughter board that's got some logic, maybe put the UART on a daughter board. But I'm holding out kind of that as a last resort. I'm looking for something with a little bit more panache. If we look at W1, I think that has the most promise. It's got 8 input bits from the keyboard data and a strobe input so the keyboard can latch in that character. The idea is that your keyboard outputs an ASCII character, it then toggles the strobe line, the 8212 latches that ASCII byte in on the falling edge of that strobe, and then it asserts the interrupt output that goes to the 8080. The 8080 read the port, which internally resets that interrupt signal from the 8212. So they have this 4-bit switch up here that sets the port address, this port address decoding logic, and then there's this import signal that's created to go out onto the bus, and this logic here decodes the port address and tells it when to read that keypad input byte. It really would have been ideal if this port in signal came after this 8-input NAND rather than as an input to that NAND. Because if they brought it in afterwards, they could have used the NAND to create a signal that when the port was being addressed, either for in or out, and then they could have gated that signal with the port read or the port write signals, and essentially they could have decoded both an input and an output port with the same hardware and gotten the output port strobe for free. Since that's a NAND and not an AND, it's going to be a little bit hard to reconfigure that, and as I said, there's no extra logic, unused gates on this board, so there's a bit of a challenge there. One option I see is if it's possible to unwind their glue logic here, rearrange some of these gates to create both an input and output port strobes. And I've searched for unused gates. The only unused items seem to be a few pull-up resistors in these resistor packs and a couple of bus drivers. And the bus drivers, even the enable is already mostly assigned, so I can't even enable or disable the bus drivers. So some of these bus drivers aren't really usable because they're only enabled part of the time. So there's not really a lot to work with if I'm moving components around or moving signals around in the existing components to get what I need. So I think I need to keep looking for options on how to connect a terminal with a bidirectional port. If we look carefully, when they created this input port, they actually do not decode the least significant bit because they used this decoding to create 2 input ports. There's the odd address that's used to enable the 8212 and read the data byte, And then the even address is used to enable this one tri-state buffer here, which puts the 8212 status bit onto the bus. So that way the user can operate the keyboard input in hold mode rather than just in interrupt mode. Since there are 2 ports assigned here, another option, rather than to try to create an output port address and specifically make an output port, is to create a binary output using an RS latch that is true or false depending on which of these 2 ports is read. And that's the technique that I use. I have these PROM to serial port adapters. There's one for the 1702 and then I have one for all the other PROMs. And so on these, the way I do this is you read the highest address where the least significant bit is 1, then it will set the transmit on the serial port to 1. And if you read the address below that where the least significant bit is set to 0, then it sets the transmit bit to 0. So you basically transmit on this by either reading the highest address or the second highest address. And then each time you read that, you get back the received bit. So that's how these adapters work that I made to go from a PROM to RS-232. So I could do that similar kind of thing on this because they've already decoded 2 addresses. One of them is going to have the least significant bit as 1 and one with the least significant bit as 0. So just by reading this port or that status bit, I could create an output serial port. Now what I would do is, so that I don't have to add a new chip to this, I would repurpose this W1 to be like a NAND gate, so I can create an RS latch on this. So I would have the RS latch where the set and reset is configured by that least significant bit in the address. So that's kind of probably my thing that has the biggest chance of success, is to replace that chip, put a chip in there that's a NAND gate to create an RS latch, and read either of those 2 ports to transmit. That's probably how I'm going to do it, but we'll see. When I capture the schematic of the board and I start playing with a layout in that section of the board, I'll get a better feel for what options I have, and maybe I can do better than just putting that RS latch out there. So you see what I have to work with. It'll be interesting to see what's possible. And if I can't do that, then at the very minimum, I'll at least be able to create a reproduction board that, just only has the exact same features of this. It won't have the serial port have the exact same features. I really hope that I can add a serial port to be fully functional so I can make this a single board computer with a terminal interface. When I get further along, I'll be back with a follow-up video. If you have any brilliant ideas on how to add a serial port on this, let me know. Until then, as always, monetization is turned off, and this channel is entirely supported by shares, likes, subscribers, and engaging comments. I will talk with you later. Bye-bye.